professor here at the Watson Institute and in political science. This is our first book Adda of the semester. This series, our book Adda series, was imagined, invented some 7-8 years ago, and we normally have 2 or 3 books each semester in this format, or discussed in this format. Those who are not familiar with South Asian terminology, an Adda is a space for collective deliberation. That's the best way to understand the term Adda. And those who are familiar with South Asia and its terminology know what it is. The second book Adda will be on November 3rd, when we discuss another recent book, Migrants and Machine Politics, on the politics of the urban poor in Bhopal and Jaipur, but take off on that. It's by Tariq Tachil and Adam Auerbach, and the book was published at Princeton University by Princeton University Press. The books we pick for discussion in this format are the books we think we should all read and discuss. That's why I picked them. They are of substantial, huge, intellectual and political significance. That's why I picked them. And then we picked 3 commentators, 2 or 3 commentators. But let me start with an introduction to the author we've chosen today and the book we've chosen. Manoj Mitta is Mitta or Mitta?
Mitta.
Mitta. Manoj Mitta is a Delhi-based journalist who has a law degree from Hyderabad and has worked with the Times of India, the Indian Express, and India Today. He has written 2 critically acclaimed books on the impunity of mass violence before this book. The first one was called When a Tree Shook Delhi, the 1984 carnage and its aftermath, which was co-authored with H.S. Phulka. And the second on mass violence and the impunity associated with it, The Fiction of Fact-Finding, Modi and Godra, published in 2014. And this most recent book that we'll be discussing over the next couple of hours is entitled Caste Pride, Battles for Equality in Hindu India. It was published, I think a couple of months ago, or maybe 3 months ago. In April, almost 6 months ago, by Westland Books in Delhi for India, for the Indian market, and hopefully it should be available in the American market before long. It concentrates on something we scholars and activists have not discussed enough. We have tackled in our research politics of caste. We have tackled in our research sociology of caste, but we haven't tackled the legal aspects of caste struggle. And let's remind ourselves that one of the finest minds on this topic, Mr. Ambedkar, was also a lawyer and had a law degree, not simply a political theorist trained at Columbia, an economist trained at LSE, but also someone called to the bar in London. And one of the reasons why he was chosen, one of the important reasons, not the only one, he was chosen to lead the drafting of the Indian Constitution was also his legal acumen and legal knowledge. This book it has emerged out of several years of research, mostly archival research that we scholars do, but But Manoj, as a journalist, decided to do that, which we, of course, welcome. It is supported by fellowships by the National Endowment of Democracy in Washington and New India Foundation in Bangalore. This is the one indicator, a good indicator of how much the book is attracting attention, is reflected in this rather interesting number. This is the first university where he's speaking, but he's going to speak at 10 more universities in the coming month or 5 weeks or so. So the 11 universities have sponsored discussion of Manoj's new book. So, and I'll introduce the discussants, 3 discussants later. He will speak to us for about 40 minutes, and then we'll have 10 to 12 minutes of discussant remarks, not beyond 15 in any case. Sometimes it's hard to say what you have to say in 12 minutes. And then that leaves us with 30 minutes, roughly 30 minutes of open Q&A. So that's the format. Let's welcome Manoj Mitta to Brown and Success Center. Would you like to sit and speak or? Oh, yeah.
Whatever. Would I be audible from this distance?
Yeah.
Is it okay? Because I have the option of sitting there, because that will make the mic closer to my mouth. Yeah. So, I'm really happy to be here, and I must begin by thanking Ashutosh Varshney for inviting me here. It means a lot to me. And yes, as he said, this is the first of a series of talks I'm giving here in the course of this book tour of the US. And as he also said, that this book is attracting attention in India and elsewhere, primarily because of its focus on the legal aspects. You know, there's a great deal of material, great deal of work available on caste, a great deal available on law, but little or nothing on the intersection of law and caste. That's the gap that this book seeks to fill. And what is striking is that if I were to compare it with the intersection of law and race, that's law and race in the US, that's far from the case. If I had attempted a similar book on anything relating to law and race, I would have struggled to find anything substantially new to say on the subject. But in contrast, when I attempted something on the intersection of law and caste, this book has 18 chapters dealing with different aspects. Every chapter, by default, I assure you it is by default, in every chapter I end up making quantum leaps in terms of new material. And this is far from what I set out to write. As he said, my earlier books dealt with mass violence, impunity for mass violence in India, right? And my original plan was merely to do another book, in a sense, complete a trilogy on mass violence, this time focusing on mass violence targeting Dalits, former untouchables. And the question that I wanted to address was, why is there so much impunity for this form of violence, despite a special law that is in place, especially since 1989? Unlike in the case of communal violence, or what you are more familiar with as sectarian violence, there is a special law, to address the peculiarities of this form of violence, right? And that special law is allegedly draconian, right? So why is there so much impunity? That's the question I wanted to address. And that is how I began this research, and I went to several places where such violence had taken place, most importantly in Bihar. And I looked at the trajectory of those cases. I saw how in, something known as Lakshmanpur Bate, which is the biggest ever instance of caste violence. Some 58 people were killed in the year 1997. And the then president, who happened to be a Dalit, K.R. Narayanan, called it a national shame, or words to that effect. And a few years later, when the trial court delivered its verdict, as many as 26 people were convicted, and out of them 16 were given death penalty. The reason I mention this figure is because in India's history, legal history, this is the largest number of death penalties given in a single case. I mean, this is more than even the number of death penalties given in Godhra, which played such a huge role in the history of our country, right? Yet, the very same case, when it goes before the High Court of Patna, every one of those convictions is reversed. All 26, including the 16, all of them acquitted. So, and I looked at how those acquittals took place. I mean, the kind of very flimsy grounds on which those acquittals were given. And this is really the pattern. This is part of the pattern of cases that you see. And another parallel with US I could see was that this violence that I was talking about, this mass violence targeting Dalits, began much after the abolition of untouchability. Before the abolition of untouchability in 1950 through Article 17 of the Constitution, before that, there wasn't anything like this on this kind of scale. Yes, there was everyday untouchability, and that is something that goes back centuries. I mean, it far predates colonial period, and there were people like Buddha onwards who were grappling with it, Basava, Kabir, Nanak. I mean, you have any number of such examples. So they were all dealing with untouchability and other forms of caste discrimination, right? But there wasn't anything of this magnitude that has been recorded in history. Not in the lifetime of Ambedkar, not in the lifetime of Gandhi, not even in the lifetime of Nehru. Why do I mention Nehru? Because Nehru was among these three the last to pass away in 1964. The first recorded instance of mass violence targeting Dalits took place in 1968 in a place called Kilvenmani in the then Madras presidency. And that really set the template for violence. That was a case in which some 42 Dalits, mostly women and children, were all burnt alive in one big hut. So when the investigation and the courts came into the picture, there was no clarity whatsoever on why so many were packed into that one room. How were they all found to have been burnt alive there? Why did they not have any opportunity to escape? Who were those people who ensured that they couldn't escape? None of such questions were answered. All that the Madras High Court was concerned about, some convictions were awarded at the trial court, again, like in the Lakshmanpur Bate case. But when Madras High Court came into the picture, it ensured that every one of them again was acquitted. And again, for very shockingly flimsy reasons, it said things like, the alleged accused are all such well-heeled people. It's very unlikely that they could have participated in this violence. They couldn't have been part of this murderous mob and reasons like that. So that Kilvenmani set the template for violence. Kilvenmani also set the template for impunity, right? So that became the pattern. And Lakshmanpur Bate was one glaring example of that. I mentioned Lakshmanpur Bate because it happened much later in 1997, and the judgment of the High Court came in 2013, so not too long ago, in the 21st century. So I suppose I said enough in this brief presentation. I said enough to give you a sense of the structural bias that is still driving India, right? So where is this structural bias coming from? Now, when I was looking at these cases, I felt that, I can't do it the way I did my earlier books, which were really extensions of my journalism. I needed to go further than, just the fact that, okay, such awful incidents took place, so much glaring evidence, and yet so little by way of justice. I am again and again telling you the same story. I felt that there was a need for me to try and understand where this was coming from. Why is there so much gap between the rhetoric and reality of Indian Republic? You know, we have this great constitution, the longest constitution, and it expressly abolishes untouchability, and it says that it's a crime, and it is followed by laws that codify the various forms of untouchability offenses and imposes penalties. So why is there so little by way of justice? So I felt the need to go into earlier debates, the debates relating to abolition of untouchability. And that was quite an eye-opener to me. It prompted me to go further back. And I found myself going very deep into archival research, into a whole lot of legislative debates that took me all the way back to early 19th century. That is, I went into debates going back 2 centuries, and these were legislative debates, judicial debates, dealing with different aspects, which shows that again and again there were these huge, battles going on over equality. As I put in my subtitle, Battles for Equality in Hindu India. Why do I put it so? Not to be just provocative. It was indeed the case. These were battles that were being fought by 2 sets of Hindus. They were not necessarily upper caste and lower caste. Especially in the earlier phase, lower caste hardly had access to legislatures. I mean, it took them a long time to gain access to, sitting at that high table was not an easy thing for them. They were all suffering from the stigma of untouchability. They had basic existential issues, so there was no question of their being able to participate in these debates. So the debates were between 2 sets of upper caste people. So it was not necessarily upper caste versus lower caste. It was debates between progressive, liberal Hindus on one side and conservative, orthodox Hindus on the other side, who very often called themselves, I'm happy to mention this because those of you who have been following debates in India would know that suddenly there's a great deal of controversy over the term Sanatanis, Sanatan Dharma. So these orthodox elements who were defending the most retrograde customs, the most retrograde practices, they would say they are doing it in the name of Sanatan Dharma. This is how it has always been. This is something that is God ordained. Who are you to tinker with it, to overturn that? So these are the kind of arguments that they were giving again and again. And on the other side were, as I said earlier, not necessarily lower caste people. In fact, in the earlier years, they were more likely to be upper caste people. So I find it very important, very strategically in today's context to mention this, to underline this fact. Because, when I put it the way I did, there was this assumption, there was this impression that it was very easy for people to assume, oh, here's a book that is out to malign Hinduism, that is out to malign Brahmins. No, a lot of characters who come out very well for the progressive positions they took, for the battles they fought to, establish equality among Hindus, were themselves Brahmins. True, on the other side also were Brahmins, right? The orthodox elements were also Brahmins. So it is not about, maligning Brahmins at all. If there is anything it is against Brahmanism, you could say. Anyway, that's a digression. So I found that whole explorations of the battles that were fought during the colonial period very instructive to understand where this deeply ingrained prejudice, where the structural bias was coming from. Now, I'll give you 2 examples to explain how that was instructive to me, to how it helped me understand that this impunity is a result of the unfinished battles of the colonial period. Now, one is, since it is largely unexplored territory, I discovered some huge seminal developments, inflection points in the history of India, not just history of caste, that went completely unrecognized, that don't figure in your history books. So one such example is that in the year 1916, sometime in March 1916, India's parliament, or whatever was its precursor then, called Imperial Legislative Council, breaks its silence on untouchability. Now, just as race was something that was integrally linked to the founding of this country, caste is central to Indian society. And yet, it was not until 1916 that this question of untouchability was discussed in Parliament, in what was called Imperial Legislative Council. And who did it? Who was the one who broke that silence? It wasn't any of the leaders you would expect to have done so. It wasn't any of the leaders that you're familiar with of that time. It wasn't any leader from the Congress party, because Congress was the big tent. It's not necessarily the Congress party of today. It was the main political force of the time, and it represented all shades of opinion. And that was probably the reason why this subject was kept out of the purview of their political interventions. They were focused on whatever they perceived as political aspirations of society. So we will keep social reform out of our discussions, lest it turns divisive. It will tear us apart and divert us from the bigger challenge of taking on colonial rule. So because of some such reasoning, from almost the founding of that party, which was in 1885, in 1886 there was actually a policy laid down by the then president, Dadabhai Naoroji, who says, okay, we will keep away from this. And they follow that line very scrupulously. And even when many of those Congress leaders, or rather some of those Congress leaders, make it to the legislature, to this parliament, people like, say, Gokhale, he was considered the first great parliamentarian because of the way he would deal with the colonial administrators on equal terms, on intricate issues of budget and so on and so forth. So he was somebody who acquired such great reputation. Now, even he kept away from the subject. Am I running out of time? No. Okay. Yeah. Give me a little warning, because I might just get carried away. And yeah. He also kept away from it. He passed away in 1915. He's the man who, soon after Gandhi comes to India, he passes away. He meets Gandhi, his protege. And another famous protege of his is none other than Jinnah. So he's that exceptional man, right? So even he never, during his entire career in Legislative Council from 1901 to 1915, he doesn't discuss this, at any rate not directly, right? So in 1916 comes along this legislator whose name is also Dadabhai, but not Dadabhai Naoroji. This is Manekji Dadabhai. And this causes a bit of confusion, because there's a passing reference to this Dadabhai, Manekji Dadabhai, in some history books. In even what is considered the most authoritative series on Ambedkar, Baba Sahib Ambedkar Writings and Speeches, that is brought out by the government. It's a compilation of all his writings. That's a must for any historian any researcher on Ambedkar. So even that gets the identity of this man wrong, because Ambedkar as a contemporary is very grateful to him. So when the editors a few decades ago were bringing this out, they had no clue to who this Dadabhai was. So they did the easy way out of referring to him in the references as Dadabhai Naoroji, little realizing the irony of it. If anything, Dadabhai Naoroji was responsible for keeping the subject of social reform or even caste reforms out of the purview of Congress. So, and such an undeserving person gets credit. And even somebody like, say, a very reputed expert on caste, Gail Ombet, in one of her books, she mentions in passing that Dadabhai Naoroji was the one who broke Parliament silence on untouchability. I mean, Dadabhai Naoroji at that time was not even in the legislature. By then he had many distinctions to his credit. He had become the first Indian parliamentarian in Britain. So he was still very much alive, but he was not there. So the Manekji Dadabhai, when he raises this issue, he raises it as a resolution to be passed, and he says, look, I am somebody who comes from central provinces. He's originally a native of Bombay. Central provinces, Nagpur area. So he says, I represent a constituency which is predominantly Hindu, and there is this problem. So I it was not unnatural of me to want a discussion on this, and some measures need to be taken, as he said, to ameliorate, for the amelioration of what were at that time called depressed classes. And
Was he a Brahmin or was he a Parsi?
Parsi. Manekji Dadabhai was a Parsi.
Parsi name, yeah.
So he says that it's a good question to ask, because two Brahmins, who were formerly Congress members, who were in fact by then already at different points of time presidents of Congress party, they were the most prominent members of the legislature at that time. One was the man who had by then founded Banaras Hindu University, Madan Mohan Malviya, and the other was Surendranath Banerjee. So both of them took serious objection to what? To an issue that was offending the religious sensibilities of Hindus. And they were offended by the fact that this man thought that untouchability was an issue that could be discussed in a legislative body of this nature. I mean, is this something that you should be doing? You are deliberately trying to malign us, offenders, and so on and so forth. So he goes on to, this man in his defense says, look, I am doing it because I have been patiently waiting for Hindus to take it up. Since nobody till now came forward to do so, I am doing it. So this is the kind of response he gives. I'm cutting a long story short. The colonial administrator says, since there is so much of a pushback to your proposal, we have sympathies for you. So what we will do is, you want it to be recognized, this set of people to be recognized as people who suffer from special, peculiar problems. So we need to start collecting data on them. We need to have special measures to address their peculiar needs. We recognize all that. We take that on board. But don't press on this resolution being put to vote, because it's already created so much of bad blood. So he accepts that. And true to their word, the center gives instructions to all provinces to start collecting data. This is how data collection on untouchables begins. And what is more, because there was a promise to make special measures, they also create a special mechanism, a special department for the first time. I mean, today we have something known as Social Welfare Ministry. Today it's called Ministry of Social Empowerment. We have some constitution bodies called Commission for Scheduled Castes. There's a Commission for Scheduled Tribes. You have a whole infrastructure in place to deal with these people. Now, this is where it all started, with Manekji Dadabhai's abortive attempt to pass a resolution, and the colonial administration's promise to work on...
Clarificatory question.
Sure.
Nothing fundamental here, only clarificatory. The census data on untouchables, quote unquote, at that time, begins only in 1921.
No.
Or the 1871 census begins. From 1871 to 1921, there is no data collected on untouchables.
It's data on what exactly, it's not about just the numbers.
Yeah.
They knew that they existed.
The numbers they knew.
They knew that, okay, pariahs existed in the Madras presidency.
I see.
But what is it? The socio-economic data.
I see.
What are the problems? What are the disabilities that they suffer from?
Got it.
What is this? What keeps them out on the margins of society? So what is it that we need to do? That kind of data was not available because they were never recognized as somebody who needed any special attention.
Got it.
So in that broad sweep of things, they remained on the margins. So this is how for the first time, among all the provinces, Madras presidency happened to be the most advanced in acting on Dadabhai's resolution, or that abortive resolution. So what did they do? They create, for the first time in 1919, a body known as Protector of Depressed Classes. And it doesn't stop with that. Here is one unsung hero. Just as I said, Manekji Dadabhai was an unsung hero who we ought to have celebrated, who we ought to have been familiar with, because he played such an important role, right? Now, another person, and this one is not even, if that man was a Parsi, this man was not even an Indian. He is a British administrator. He was the governor of Madras at the time, who had already been governor of Bombay, and then who went on to become Governor General of Canada, and then he becomes the Viceroy of India. I'm talking about Lord Willingdon, a very distinguished career. But one of his most important achievements is something that's completely gone unrecognized, and that is he had this vision. He had this, this audacity to think of appointing an untouchable as a legislator. He nominates one. He recognizes the fact that because they are so marginalized, it is because they are so despised. And remember, Madras did not just have untouchability. Famously in the last decade of the 19th century, when Vivekananda goes on his Bharat Darshan before he comes to US, to Chicago and becomes a huge celebrity, he goes around the country. And when he reaches the south and he comes to the parts which are now Kerala, and then after that he reaches Madras, so by then he understands what is going on. It comes as an eye-opener. It comes as a big shock to him to see, look, I've traveled across the country. I know about this pernicious practice of untouchability. And he is himself a Shudra. This Caste who are part of Bhadralok were technically, it's something that Caste were happy to be called so, that Shudra. He was considered a Shudra also. So he had a natural sympathy for oppression, marginalization and all that. So when he comes here, he sees something that blows his mind. He says, this place, he famously calls that place a lunatic asylum. Why? Because he says, in the rest of the country you see untouchability. What you see here is unapproachability. Meaning, just the fact that man is walking on the same street at a distance is polluting to me. In the rest of the country, that man should actually have touched me. Then I'm polluted. I need to then go through some atonement, some cleansing and all that.
Here, the saint calls it unseeability of Kerala. Unseeability.
Yeah, unseeability is another variant of that. So we are talking about that in Kerala and in Madras presidency. You have so there's a bit of this because of that extreme form of untouchability that was practiced. So the reforms also were taking place there, before other parts. So what is the reform? The big reform was that Willingdon, on his own initiative, at that time Congress was yet to ask for any such thing. Congress had not spoken about untouchability for decades. After Manekji Dadaboy's initiative, they are shamed into discussing and passing a resolution on untouchability in their own forum, the Congress forum, which met every December, for the first time in 1917, right? And then in 1919, they were far from asking for anything like, okay, at that time, there were these constitutional reform debates that were going on. It was a run-up to what was called the 1909 Government of India Act, Montagu-Chelmsford reforms. So they were discussing what are all the reforms that we could make. So this man, Willingdon, he anticipated that Montagu-Chelmsford reforms, and he comes up with this historic initiative of nominating a Dalit, an untouchable, to the legislature. And it is historic because what it meant was suddenly at the high table will be sitting somebody whose very presence would normally be considered polluting. And now, because of the protocol of that institution, even that wretched Dalit would have to be addressed as Honorable Mr. His name was M.C. Raja. So if you look at it with some degree of empathy, you would appreciate the revolutionary nature of that very simple appointment that he made, the nomination that he made. But we were too caught up in our own, just as, the current dispensation in India says, nothing that happened before 2014 is worth remembering, or it is only after 2014 all the worthwhile things are happening, you are filled with pride and so on and so forth. So there was probably that kind of mindset at work even in that period before 2014. Only the political struggle waged by Gandhi and his acolytes got all the attention that it deserved for sure. But the parallel social struggle that was going on, and it's a struggle that predates colonial period. It has been going on from the times of Buddha, as I said, and it continues to go on. It didn't end with August 15, 1947. It is there even in today's India. It never got its due. On the contrary, those who were entering legislatures and trying to do these reforms were all dismissed as people who collaborated with, including somebody like Ambedkar, people who never participated in the freedom struggle. So their whole patriotism were all questionable. That's how, in that narrative, these people, even a man like Ambedkar did not get his due, so what to speak of others? So in that context, there are a whole lot of such people who never got their due, right? So now, after the Montego-Chelmsford reforms takes place, there were a whole lot of untouchables who got access, like MC Raja was the first, but it didn't stop with him. And the people they chose were not some token nominees. They were indeed people who were very feisty, very assertive about equality. And the best of them was a man who never got his due. And he did something that was even more revolutionary. What did he do? He is responsible. Imagine the nature, the very fundamental nature of changes that they made, and yet they never got their due. So this man is responsible, is instrumental in enacting the first ever legislation against untouchability anywhere in the country. And this was in Madras province. So admittedly, it was at the provincial level, and it was not a very big law. It's a baby step. But all the same, the fact that it was the first ever is a development that should have been recognized, that should have been known, and he should have,
MC Raja.
No, not MC Raja. This man is R. Veerayan.
And what period are we talking about?
This was in 1926. He is instrumental in passing the first ever legislation against untouchability in Madras presidency, and we know nothing about him. And when I recently had, I had book events all over the country, in Madras presidency, in today's Chennai, I had very distinguished people sitting on the panel like this. V. Geeta, I don't know if you people are familiar with it. She's an expert on Periyar and Ambedkar. And Ravi Kumar, who's an MP from a Dalit party. There was one Virudalai Rajendran, who was a flag bearer for Periyar in today's. And there's Meena Kandaswamy. They were all people who have rich grassroots experience of engaging with caste in Chennai. And again, they were making this point. Yet this book comes along and tells us so many new things about what happened in our own province. We did not know about the seminal work done by somebody like R. Veerayan. This was one of the reasons why they were so appreciative of this book. And all this happened simply because, as I said, anything concerning legal aspects of caste somehow was missed by historians and sociologists, despite all the volume of work available on it. Anything concerning this, maybe they felt it was a little too technical for whatever reason, they missed out on it. But anyway, I'm digressing. So the point I'm making is that such people who made such huge contributions never got their due, and that it doesn't end with, say, Veerayan.
Can I ask you one more clarificatory question?
Sure.
When does Gandhi first propose abolish untouchability? 1919 or before?
Okay.
Yeah.
1920 is when
1920.
Gandhi captures is a bad word. He becomes the unchallenged leader in the Nagpur session of
December
Congress
1920.
in December 1920, right? And it is at that session, he, after 1917 was the first time Congress ever passes a resolution, and the second time it passes a resolution was in 1920, and this time at the instance of Gandhi. It was formally moved by Chittaranjan Das, and it was seconded by Gandhi, and it talks about how this is. I discuss it in it's something that we as caste Hindus need to address seriously, and so on and so forth. It's not something that it asks for government's intervention. They were always very particular that government should have no role in it. Right from Tilak's days onwards, this comes through for the first time in the context of in 1890-91 there was this huge debate over age of consent bill. The idea was to just raise the age of consummation of marriage from 10 from the age of 10 to 12. It was a very, very modest measure, something that was triggered by the death of one child bride in Bengal presidency. And then there were people from the Hindu right, like Lokmanya Tilak, who all said there's no way we're going to let you do that because you are interfering with our religious feelings and all that. If there were any issues, we will address them in good time when we come to power. So that was an attitude that a lot of these leaders took, and even Gandhi showed that attitude. And throughout 1920s, even after this resolution was adopted in the Nagpur session of Congress, throughout 1920s, he was an unabashed votary of Varna. I'll come to that in a little bit. I was on this track of untouchability related measures. So after this happens in 1926, in 1937, after the Government of India Act of 1935, Congress comes to power for the first time in different provinces. So Rajaji, Rajagopalachari, who goes on to become the Governor General of India later, he becomes what was known as the Premier of Madras Presidency, and on his watch, the first ever state level legislation is made. That was a very small measure, a baby step that this man had taken as a private bill. He gets it enacted, Virayan. So this is something that the government is now backing it. So it is hailed as the first, legislation against untouchability, overlooking Virayan's credit, Virayan's, contribution, which predates this by over a decade, right? He never gets his due. Now, this Rajaji's measure is talked about, but what is overlooked is Rajaji's measure, unlike Virayan's measure, doesn't talk of this being an offense. It doesn't penalize it. All it says is that it's a declaratory law. It says that this form of discrimination will not be backed by any legislative or administrative body. So it is merely declarative, right? It took a great deal of, negotiation. They betrayed a great deal of reluctance to finally reconcile themselves to recognizing it as an offense around the time of independence. Because in 1937, when this debate took place in Madras, in Bombay, at the same time, Ambedkar was by then in the Bombay legislature. He and his party opposed a similar attempt to deal with untouchability on the ground that you cannot have, it was better than the Bombay legislature in the sense that it recognizes it as a penal offense, unlike the Madras legislature, which simply is a declaratory law. This one recognizes it as a penal offense, but doesn't consider it a cognizable offense. What this technicality means is that it is not an offense which the police can register a case on, what we in India call FIR, First Information Report. The police will not take responsibility for investigating that case on your behalf and bring the culprits to book. No. It will instead be treated as a non-cognizable offense, which means that it is for you, if you are aggrieved by somebody's action, it is for you to lodge a private complaint before a magistrate, engage a private lawyer, and then fight that case. So this man pointed out, if untouchables had such resources, why would this problem exist in the first place? So you need to, but that's the best that, Congress leaders of the time, B.G. Kher, who was the premier, and K.M. Munshi, who was his home minister, this is all they could do. They were all doing it in a very small, incremental way. Why? Where was this coming from? Because for decades, for centuries, you are accustomed to seeing this as part of your religious entitlement, your religious responsibility. I cannot let this wretched man touch me because it's polluting to me. So how can that same thing now, it's part of my religious practice, how can you now overnight turn that into an offense, a criminal offense? So that was the issue that they were grappling with, which is why, I called my book Caste Pride, because I wanted to get away from what is normally done, which is you look at the plight of untouchables, right? A lot of work is done on that. I am consciously shifting the gaze from the plight of untouchables to the attitudes and dilemmas, the prejudices betrayed by Yapakas. So here is an example that at every step, they show such reluctance. So it's only around the time of independence when it suddenly becomes untenable, now it's no more available to them, that excuse that, under colonial rule, all sorts of excesses, atrocities take place, therefore this is happening. Now you are going to be in power, or you've come into power, so this excuse is not available to you anymore. Now you yourself have to do it. The buck stops with you. So then, out of that helplessness, to save their face, they very reluctantly, in that very incremental way, they allow the untouchability offense to become cognizable. It becomes cognizable only around the time of independence, right? And then in 1954, after independence, when the Nehru government, in pursuance of that constitutional measure of Article 17, which formally abolishes caste, it also says that there shall
abolishes caste or untouchability?
Sorry. Thank you very much. That was a very big slip of tongue. In fact, that's also a part of the debate, that how untouchability is a symptom. Caste is the cause, right? It abolishes untouchability. So in that Article 17, it says that there shall be a law to give flesh to this abolition, the law that will codify the offences and impose penalties. So when that was finally done in 54, they were showing no great hurry. Finally in 54 it is introduced, and this Ambedkar at the time was an opposition leader in Rajya Sabha. So he rises on that occasion to launch a scathing attack on the Nehru government. What was the provocation for it? He was offended by the fact that the then Home Minister, K.N. Kadju, he introduces the bill, pilots the bill. Now, whoever pilots the bill is somebody who will, in the normal course, be selling that bill to the House. But what does Kadju do? He makes it very clear. Now, this is not a matter of opinion. This is something that is there, recorded in. That's why I say, the evidence is so glaring. It's there, all hidden in plain sight. I have no idea why nobody thought of it or thought of writing on this. So Kadju says, look, I am supposed to be piloting this bill, but my heart is not in it, because this is not the way we do it. We have what he calls it a Gandhian approach in mind, which is that you win people over. You change their hearts. You don't have to make it a crime. You don't have to penalize them. You don't put them behind bars, because if you put somebody behind bars, there's only going to be more hatred in his heart. So he says words to that effect, and Ambedkar gets so offended that this man is formally piloting the bill, but in reality is actually running it down. He's making it very clear that the government doesn't have its heart in it, right? So the point I'm making is that when this was the attitude that the government of India in the nascent Indian Republic displayed at the highest level, right? So this man says, Ambedkar says, it looks like Kadju himself wants to practice untouchability, because he is making it clear that there shall be no conviction for it, because on paper he says, okay, if you commit untouchability, you will either be given a small imprisonment up to 6 months, maximum 6 months, or, it doesn't say and, it says or it can be just a monetary penalty, and there's no lower limit for that. So Ambedkar says it could be just 1 rupee or whatever, some such token imprisonment, and you get away with it. So he exposes them, and he goes on to give all sorts of measures, which were all sorts of alternative provisions, which were considered far too radical at that time. But by and by, in 70s, in Indira Gandhi's time, many of them were incorporated. So he was posthumously vindicated. So to cut a long story short, what I'm trying to say is that all this shows that there was no change of heart. When India attained independence, it was not a change of heart that led to the abolition of untouchability. It was not a change of heart that led to the enactment of these provisions. It was sheer expediency. I mean, there had no other option, and they made no bones about their reluctance. They were not doing it in spirit. It was more in letter. And if that was what was happening at the legislature level in Delhi, is it any surprise that when this assertion of equality post-Ambedkar, some of these Ambedkarites were becoming more and more assertive, then that led to this pushback. And that pushback finally took the form of that mass violence I told you about, the first instance at Kilvenmani. So is it any surprise that, when it came to implementation of these laws, that there was such impunity? When you see this kind of attitude, this is how I was tying it all up. Now, in the 5 minutes that I have, I want to say something else about this is what academics normally call anti-untouchability, movement, measures and all that. They make a distinction between what is against untouchability and what is against caste. There is a distinction. So against caste, I want to say in 1918, that is 2 years after Manakji makes this revolutionary measure, he introduces it. There was this man from one of the intermediate castes, Patels, that is Vithalbhai Patel, who introduces the first ever bill to legalize intercaste marriage. And again there was a pushback. From who? Again Madan Mohan Malviya and Banerjee, because they happened to be members of the legislature at the time. And again they raised this banner of Hindu khatre mein hai. How can you allow intercaste marriage? And there were, like in today's India, there were lots of people who were vulnerable to that kind of rhetoric, and there was heavy opposition to it. So the government says, okay, we will circulate this bill around the country and let there be feedback. And when the feedback comes, now maybe he was being a little too self-serving, maybe there was a lot of wishful thinking in it. Now, as the mover of the bill, it was left to this man, Vithalbhai Patel, to interpret it. So he says, okay, most of India seems to be open to it. If there's anybody who's opposed to it, it is Brahmins. So he ends up attacking Brahmins. So the Congress, the executive, the colonial executive, butts in and says, if you had any chance of getting this measure passed, now you have kissed goodbye to those chances. Why? Because you've done the unthinkable, which is in India you can't attack Brahmins and hope to get that measure passed, because however small that minority is, that elite captured the hearts and minds of Hindus. So you can't do that. And sure enough, that's exactly what happened. The bill was not passed, and it took a 30-year battle. Again and again, several legislators attempted it, and several of them were upper caste people. And in between those 30-year battle, there's one sect of Hinduism, that is Arya Samaj, who in the year 1937 get a bill passed for that small sector. Whoever is willing to go to an Arya Samaj temple and say they subscribe to Arya Samaj and away from Sanatan Dharma, away from mainstream Hinduism, they could resort to intercaste marriage, right? And finally in 1949, so I'm coming to the end of my talk, in 1949, I'm happy to say that it's one Brahmin legislator, because strategically it's important for me to make this point that this is not against Brahmins, it is against Brahminism. So it was a Brahmin legislator from Punjab, Thakur Das Bhargava, who introduces a bill, and he pays tribute to Patel and says this bill should ideally be called Patel Hindu marriage validation bill, in the very American style. Here you are accustomed to bills being named after, legislation being named after the man who piloted it, or the legislator who piloted it. So he says that, that's, and the interesting part is not so much that he remembered, that he had a sense of history, that he was carrying forward what Vithalbhai Patel had started 30 years later. The interesting thing was that when he introduces this bill in 49, unlike the opposition, the stiff opposition that Patel saw in 1918, this man meets with absolutely no opposition at all. There was unanimous approval of his bill. Nobody disapproved of it, except for one very unlikely person. Who raised objections, who had reservations about it?
Perhaps a Dalit.
No.
No.
Sorry, who did you say?
No, go ahead. Yeah.
It was Ambedkar. Why did Ambedkar oppose it? Not because he had any reservations about intercaste marriage at all. It was for a very personal reason, which is that he says, I'm in the process of pushing this Hindu Code Bill, which is a comprehensive reform of the entire Hindu law, and legalization of intercaste marriage is very much a part of it. So why are you resorting to this piecemeal legislature? So Bhargava says, in his defense, that I don't know what your reading of the situation is. It's very unlikely that you will get your bill passed. I have a greater chance of getting my bill passed because there's anyway no opposition to it. You are dealing with even more radical things. The most radical of it was giving equal rights to daughters, And then one of the most radical things was diluting the concept of marriage being a sacrament, turning it into a contract, like in the case of these wretched Muslims. How can you, ye janam janam ka sathi hai, however bad my spouse is, you are stuck with him, right? So that is the Hindu notion. It is indissoluble. And you are now saying, let divorce be there. How? Those are very radical. Those are things that have raised the hackles of these guys. So they have let go of this, their opposition to intercaste. So let this measure be passed. So in 1949, that is how intercaste marriage bill is enacted. Now, one more little thing I'll add before I end. That is, in 1954, there's another marriage, controversy that takes place in Madras. This is about Rajaji. Rajaji by then becomes chief minister of Madras presidency. And there were a different kind of marriage-related reform that the reformists in Madras were fighting for under the leadership of Periyar. He's a non-Brahmin leader. He's the head of the non-Brahmin movement. So his whole point was, let's have a self-respect form of marriage, which does away with this element of patriarchy, which is that a marriage is performed only if the bride is donated by the bride's father to the bridegroom.
Kanyadan.
That only when there is Kanyadan. So he says, it's time for us to introduce some semblance of self-respect, give equality to Hindu women too. So it should be, like in the case of Christians or Muslims, a union of two equals, which is entirely based on consent, right? So they were fighting for that. But in 1954, Madras High Court strikes down that self-respect form of marriage, Suya Maryade form of marriage, saying that this is contrary to our custom, Hindu recognized custom, which is all Brahminical. So a Brahmin has to solemnize it. He has to officiate at that wedding, and he has to chant his mantras, which is appropriate to your caste. If you are an upper caste, he uses Vedic mantras, and if you are lower caste, which is the case for most of the people, because majority of Hindus are lower caste, majority of Hindus are Shudras. In theory, it's a fourfold Varna system, but the three elite Varnas, Brahmins, Kshatriyas and Vaishyas, constitute a tiny minority. It is Shudras who are the overwhelming majority, and below them are Atishudras or the Dalits. Between them, they constitute, the recent caste census showed, they constitute over 80% of Hindu population, right? So they were saying that this is something where we don't need to go to a Brahmin to solemnize it. Why should we have to depend on him? So there were reforms at multiple levels, doing away with the role of priest, doing away with the centrality of patriarchy, Kanyadan and all that. So the High Court, Madras High Court in independent India, post all this high-sounding rhetoric in our constitution, the reality was that the Madras High Court said, nothing doing. It didn't say it is non-Brahminical, therefore it says, no, it's against our custom. So the Madras, what did Rajaji do in response to that? He was asked to come up with a bill which will overcome this retrograde judgment. Now, Rajaji is most reluctant to do so. He doesn't say, okay, non-Brahminical forms of wedding also should be accepted. So what he does is he calls it a non-conforming form of marriage. So I will give them a one-time amnesty scheme. So he takes this very condescending attitude that these wretched lower castes who constitute majority of Hindus, they got misled by these by this leader Periyar and got married in ways that are not recognized by law. So they are all caught in this illicit relationship, and their children are all considered illegitimate. So what we will do is we will give them the option of lining up before various government offices and registering their marriage, and then they can get recognition. And then future marriages cannot take place because now the High Court has made it clear that this form of marriage is illegal. So this is the kind of intervention he came up with. More than a decade later, in the year 1967, that an offshoot of Periyar's movement, that is DMK, comes to power under Annadurai. And one of the first things Annadurai does is he gets the Hindu Marriage Act, the central law, amended in Tamil Nadu, and Suya Maryada, a form of marriage, is legally recognized. So such are the battles that were fought, whether it's on the front of battling against untouchability or battling against caste. So all that led to this kind of impunity, which we still today, we still see, and the kind of news cycle we still see of some form, some excess, some violation, some atrocity still being committed in this day and age in 21st century. Thank you very much.
Do you think we can, Alex? Yeah? Okay, so we will have the first commentator from New York via Zoom. As soon as you're ready, let me know. Yes, she's here.
Hi, can you all hear me?
Yes, can I introduce you?
Sure.
Yeah. Professor Anupama Rao is a professor of history and at Barnard in Columbia. And her research and teaching interests are in gender and sexuality studies and caste and race. Let me, in the interest of maximizing time for discussion, just simply add that she is director of the Institute of Comparative Literature and Society and convener of the Ambedkar Initiative at Barnard or at Columbia.
At ICLS at Columbia.
At Columbia. She is the convener of the Ambedkar Initiative at Columbia. So, Anupama, you have 10 to 12 minutes for your commentary. Yeah.
Sure,
I'll watch you from here.
Okay. Thank you so much for having me. And I'm sorry not to be there. But in any case, let me start. Indian democracy has been vigorously contested and challenged, and caste has been central to it. Demands for substantive equality has made use of reservations or affirmative action policies to demand redress for historic discrimination. They've also made claims on visibility in the public sphere, whether through insurgent politics or a politics of presence and the takeover of physical space. This politics of presence and demands for redistribution have heightened, I'd like to suggest, conflict around caste in the present, forcing us to think about political violence as integral to democratic transformation rather than aberrant to it. That these challenges are the result of the long history of anti-caste radicalism in thought and activism is also to be noted. Simultaneously, religious nationalism and market fundamentalism are transforming the democratic state in fundamental ways. A critical observer would mark the conflicts between secularism and democracy, though Hindu majoritarianism has increasingly come to equate the two, and between democracy and capital, with the growing marketization of state and rising social inequality. This suggests that democracy is a project with divergent meanings and with contingent outcomes. If democracy is predicated on the figure of the citizen and the idea of equality, it's also a historic form and a cultural concept, the terms of which are subject to political negotiation and revision. The transformation of subjects into citizens is contingent on historical circumstances, while the idea of equality has developed in relation to efforts to overcome the inequities produced by various forms of embodied difference. So just as there's nothing in the logic of social formations that guarantees an automatic transformation of subjects into citizens, there is no unitary definition of equality or of citizenship around which political subjectivity coheres. Indeed, what's distinctive in India is the constitutional commitment to group parity, and until recently, the commitment to equality of outcomes through group preference rather than the abstract commitment to equality. In other words, caste has been with us all along, although its relevance has been ignored or invisibilized as much as it has been acknowledged. The regulation of caste and the persistence of caste prejudice and caste violence in the aftermath of the abolition of untouchability, as Manoj Mitta argued today and argues in his book, is a puzzle that many have taken up, including myself with half of my book, The Caste Question, being devoted to the question of the legal regulation of caste crime and a historical ethnography of regional cases of caste atrocity. I therefore couldn't be more pleased to participate in this discussion, albeit virtually, of Manoj Mitta's book, Caste Pride, which offers an important account of the regulation of the social relations of caste by colonial law and the post-colonial legal regime. Oftentimes, as he has suggested today, as well as in the book, with post-colonial legal positions ignoring or more significantly undoing efforts by the colonial regime to redress caste inequality, such as, for instance, the 1850 Caste Disabilities Removal Act, which protected the right to co-partnery property of those who had exercised the right of conscience, for instance, through religious conversion, and had been outcasted for this purpose. That this is a contradictory history, a history of many players with often surprising ideologies, as has been pointed out to us today, that this is a contradictory history and a set of zigzagging efforts, one step forwards, two steps back, makes, I think, caste pride an important and necessary intervention. But I will, in the state of things, focus a little bit more on asking some critical questions rather than speaking to all of the positive things about this book, which ranges across, I think, just about 600 pages, if I'm not mistaken. So it is quite a tome and requires, I think, quite serious reading and engagement. Mitta tells us that he did not set out to write this book, but rather to complete what was perhaps a trilogy around different forms of social violence and violation to which minority communities have been subject in the political present. He has written, of course, about anti-Sikh riots in 1984, as well as the 1992 Gujarat anti-Muslim violence after Godhra, which was focused on Ahmedabad city in particular and led to new forms of spatial inequality and social segregation. He wanted, he tells us, to write about anti-Dalit violence today with a view to understanding why caste atrocities were on the increase and occurring with impunity. Instead, the book that he wrote explores the long-standing regulation of caste relations and the law's signal role in the reproduction of caste hierarchy. We know that the hierarchy of the caste order and untouchability are definitionally part of the religious world of Hinduism. That is, the caste order is the constitutive social order of Hinduism. It's impossible to conceive of a Hindu society unmarked by caste hierarchy, and hence the subtitle of Caste Pride too. The problem here, of course, is of the civic and the social, that is, of an impunity which exceeds state governmentality. And perhaps this is why the question of regulating caste exceeds everything from the regulation of the breast cloth in Kerala to the regulation of other forms of social practices. What kinds of clothing do you wear? Can you wear jewelry? To indeed forms of land grab and economic dispossession, in addition to other forms of social and political humiliation. So the fact that caste really moves between this domain of state and society, I think, is quite important to keep in mind. So the problem for those modern reformers who would like to rid Hinduism of caste, like Gandhi, but not only Gandhi, of course, is that they saw the outcast as definitionally a part of Hindu society rather than outside of it. The inside of caste, endogamy, is thus essential to reproducing castes and the relationship between them, but it also makes the caste order unstable since it's predicated on an absolute ban on sexual relations across caste, an impossibility that the Dharmashastric literature itself references through the multiplication of new caste names, and in the attentive manner in which in Caste Pride, Manoj Mitta actually attends across several chapters to this question of intercaste marriage and the ability to both regulate and legislate for it, but as well the discussion of the social forms of engagement, the living arrangements and so forth that occurred between castes in precisely what Rajaji comes to call the non-conforming marriage and the long history of it. Someone like Ambedkar, for instance, would argue that Dalits, like Muslims, should be given the recognition of externality implicit in the status of a minority. But this produced a double bind. The logic of the demand for political separation and its recognition is also predicated on the conditions of humiliation, enforced servitude, and lack of dignity that binds them to caste Hindus. And it's this double bind, being within and without, that makes the law such a potent weapon of possible redress. In the short remaining time I have for my comment, I want to take up a couple of ways in which scholars of modern South Asia have tended to think about law, as well as its relationship to politics and society, and what this book might offer us as an alternative. I think I wanted to challenge both a somewhat ahistorical presentation of law and caste pride, and to challenge Manoj Mitta's suggestion that scholars have not really looked at the relationship between caste and law, which I find somewhat surprising as a comment, though it might also depend on what we mean by law or how we think about its relationship to politics and society. And I think it would be really interesting to have this conversation between sort of historians who've tended to think about law and the social, but perhaps through regional histories, as opposed to the kind of argument that Manoj wants to be making in this book. Let me put before us two binaries that are useful for historicizing events as well as legal categories. And I'll start with the colonial period first. The first, I think, is the distinction between law and custom, and relatedly the divide between law and violence. As the British established colonial rule, custom or customary law, which regulated caste as well as gender relations, was assumed to be both arbitrary and excessive. A great deal of effort was spent by the company state until 1857, 1858, when the Crown takes over the administration of India, to target customary practices which were viewed as barbaric or inhuman, and to redefine them as crime. This is indeed what happened with sati in 1827, which is discussed in Caste Pride, but as well with other practices associated with Dalit Bahujan communities, such as hook swinging or animal sacrifice. Indeed, the expansion of colonial legality redefined custom as crime, and it simultaneously established a divide between law and violence, with the former, with law, being viewed as both reasonable and rehabilitating. As many of us have argued, there were two simultaneous processes taking place. The first was, of course, the colonial dependence on upper castes and the forms of knowledge about society and hierarchy produced by them in approaching the Indian social. And this is, I think, indeed what produces this very interesting framework where you have colonial administrators and perhaps our Parsi reformers and others offering rather progressive positions that are increasingly being undone or reformulated or in many ways euphemized or tamed by upper caste reformers across the late 19th and the 20th centuries. Right? Now, so this is something that the book Caste Pride explores with remarkable detail and description by showing us how social relations of caste, especially everyday relations, that reproduced prejudice and humiliation was also both reproduced by the British and sometimes legislated against. The second was to reclassify social practices and social relations between groups in the interest of modernizing them. The modernization of relations of gender, especially the status of upper caste women, through the regulation of sati, debates about widow remarriage or the age of consent, were a part of a cluster of legal interventions that produced new ideas about female agency, mens rea, intent, consent, and so on. Now, here it seems to me that scholars have argued that legal categories transformed and produced new ideas of individuality, personhood, and importantly, they transformed the idea of rights itself. This again explains why law becomes such an important locale for marginalized groups, with its relationship to political society euphemized and its potential to reset the terms of politics, thus appear as a form of social justice. I think it's this set of rather broad ideological transformations that could have been further highlighted as the colonial context in which the discrete laws and legal debates that Manoj Mitta takes up in this book are to be placed. To be sure, there were important debates about property rights for the Dasiputra, that is, for the children born of relationships between Shudra men and Brahmin women or women from the twice-born communities, or the rights of those who challenged the power of Brahmins to officiate at weddings, for instance, the self-respect and the Satyashodak marriages, which are taken up in this book. But we also see simultaneously internal transformations within caste communities at this time, including among Dalit Bahujan communities, who had embraced earlier the Satyashodak critiques of Brahmanism, but who across the late 19th and the 20th centuries, early 20th centuries, increasingly challenged those self-same critiques of caste hierarchy by embracing forms of political non-Brahmanism, which would also go on to stigmatize the Dalit castes. Or there's the intriguing manner in which late colonial legislation of caste relations, through debate about public access or access to public roads, water bodies, and indeed to the Hindu temple, increasingly sought to align the exclusion of caste with the regime of private property, which was itself predicated on forms of legalized exclusion and spatialized capture. That is, I think I'm fundamentally asking, this is the big question that I'm asking Manoj Mitta, is whether it's possible that focusing on law ignores historicizing it or its relationship to politics and society. That is, we get in history of an account of changing positions of individuals who drafted bills or engaged in debates, but not, it seems to me, a sense of the changing surround. So what indeed is the relationship to law and politics, to law, or between law and changing ideologies and practices that would create a kind of a set of linkages between law, politics, and society? And I think this would then begin to pose a set of questions about how we would understand the post-independence period, where indeed I think Manoj is very right to argue that the standard divide of 1947 just doesn't hold, because the regulation of caste and the relations of caste actually exceed or really transform the ways in which we think about that divide, so that the constant legislation and the re-legislation in 1955, then in 1972, and then 1989 finally, which is the Protection of Atrocities Act, that those incremental ways to regulate anti-Dalit violence and to regulate caste crime really begin to produce, it seems to me, a very new history and a politics for the post-colonial state. So I think I'm really just going to stop here, as I said, both by recognizing the immense contributions of the work and what it tells us about the importance for thinking about law as such, for its relationship to caste as a regulatory order that transcends the civil society state divide. But then I think to ask this question about, is it really the case that nobody has thought about law and caste? It seems to me instead that from the Dharmashastric literature onwards, caste has always been about something that we might consider law or law-like. And I think I'll stop here.
Our next commentator is Poulomi Chakrabarti, who received her PhD in political science from Brown in 2019 and is currently assistant professor in the Department of Political Science at Queen's University in Canada, and is at Harvard, has been at Harvard it's his second year at Harvard as a visiting scholar in the Department of Government, and before that at the Weatherhead Center. Her PhD dissertation tackles the question of caste, especially the relationship between caste and dignity. So 10 minutes.
Ashu, thanks for inviting me. It's an honor to be able to speak about this book, and it's an honor to be back here at Brown and Watson. So I did my PhD here, and I spent most of my waking hours in this building. So for those of you who know me, so it's also nice to see some familiar, friendly faces. About this book, and I think that you're probably like sick of hearing this already, that this is an excellent book, very meticulously researched. And to be honest, I have like zero critiques. But I work on caste and development, but I'm trained as a political scientist. And what people in my tribe tend to do is that we write general theories. So unlike, say, area studies people or historians in Wazira, you can correct me if I'm wrong, the places that we study are mere cases of a certain phenomena, and what we're trying to do is create some sort of a general theory about social change, economic change, political change, for example, right? So I thought that I would approach this book from the same angle and talk about how the findings of this book inform some theories in political science and sociology or social science in general, and how it also challenges some of these theories, and maybe, like, if I have time, talk a little bit about a research agenda that it can possibly suggest. So let me go back to Horowitz's famous classification of societies, ethnic societies, where he talks about ranked ethnic systems and unranked ethnic systems. So ranked systems are when class and ethnicity overlap. So this could be, say, in the case of slavery or in the case of caste in India. And it has a few common features regardless of the context. The first would be occupational division of labor, which is true for caste. You've talked about it earlier. Also true for slavery, also true for colonialism. And then there are norms of intergroup behavior. So segregation is the first thing that comes to mind, and this could be social segregation, so norms of endogamy, for example, or it's spatial segregation as well. So Dalits live in the outskirts of towns and villages. And it's also economic segregation, which kind of like goes back to the idea of division of labor. And then there are these norms of deference between group A and group B, right? So like you bow your head, or you like, and these are all humiliating forms of deference. But what puts it all like sort of together, why people don't protest, why group B doesn't protest group A, is this ideology, where hierarchy is something that's accepted by both the group at the bottom and the group at the top. So an example of this could be, like in the case of caste, is Brahmanism, where the idea that you're born into a certain caste because of, if I'm born into a lower caste, it must be because of terrible things I've done in my last life, and I must repent this in this life, so that, and if I do my job, which was karma, the next life I might get to be a Brahmin, or if I protest too much, I get to be a cockroach, or I don't know. And this is not very different from like the ideas that support colonialism, which is this idea of civilizational progress, that, you know, like some societies are just not ripe enough to govern themselves, right? Like they lack, they're barbaric. They are not educated enough. I mean, that's the reason the British justified rule over India for too long, and that's the reason why Indian elites let them do that for so long, right? And this is similar to scientific racism as well. I won't get into the details. But, and these are examples of segregation. One would be the segregation between Indians and the British. The second is segregation between lower caste and upper caste. And this is like this is contemporary, outside a temple that says that lower castes are not allowed. So what this book made me think, and especially all the conflicts that you write about between caste groups and between all these individuals, is that we are looking at multiple levels of hierarchy. So if we look at Indian society at that time, so at the top I would argue that there's the colonial masters, the British, then there are the upper castes, and then there are the lower castes. And all of these guys, like, forget the British, both the upper caste and the lower caste are fighting for equality, right? And both of these groups feel that they need dignity, they're fighting humiliation, but the level of contestation, the unit of contestation in these two cases would be quite different. So the upper castes are fighting colonialism, and what they would want is sovereignty. And here the level of contestation, the unit of contestation is the nation. And the ideology that they're fighting is the ideology of what we talked about earlier, civilizational progress, right? And this becomes especially relevant after Japan starts doing well, so there's this idea that there's nothing inherently weak about Asian societies. It's just that technology came here later, and if we get our act together, it's possible to throw out the colonialists, right? But the lower castes, their fight is more internal. They're fighting something that's within the Hindu society, and therefore, the subtitle of the book makes a lot of sense. And what they're fighting is the caste ideology, right? So what was quite interesting about the actors in if you were to think about all these individuals as actors, is that most of them are upper caste. And it's interesting to think about what ideologies they ascribe to, and what their interests are, and how it. Oh, already?
5 minutes. 5 minutes.
Okay, all right. So I would classify these actors as three big groups. So the first one is the hardcore castes, who very much ascribe to this ideology of purity, pollution. They would not drink tea from with a lower caste person, no matter whether they're educated, whether they are in the same social circles. And to me, it was very interesting that many of these guys that you write about and are the founders of the Hindu Mahasabha, and the current Hindu right draws its lineage to the first group. So the second group is the caste. I'm calling them the casteist liberals, and these are people who generally think that there's the political life and then there's the social life, and the state should not interfere in the social realm too much. And some of the more progressive people in your book belong to this category, and it's really interesting that they have these lofty ideas about equality in their speeches and their writings, but when it comes to caste, they're not very progressive, right? And some of these guys are actually they don't hate lower caste, so some of them would have started schools to educate them, but when it comes to political life, they want the two separated. And then there's this third group where it's not entirely clear what their own ideology might be, and I think Gandhi might be part of this camp, where they don't want to mix politics and society simply for strategic reasons, because they want everyone to come together, right? So if you anger the casteist liberals or the hardcore castists, you're not a united front, and then it'll not be possible to fight colonialism, right? And the interesting thing about political ideology in contemporary India is that so ideology in Indian politics is not this left versus right by ideology. It's about what the ideal role of the state should be. And people on the right are the ones who believe that the state should not interfere too much into society, let society reform itself. And the ones on the left would want, say, greater reservations, would want state intervention. So again, it's very interesting that like the current contemporary ideology goes back to the ideology of the actors that you wrote about.
You'll have to summarize very quickly. We have no time.
Okay, so what I'm going to do...
Is this the last slide?
No.
You'll have to go to the last slide. Sorry,
Okay.
I'm sorry, there's no other way.
No, like I...
But it's really so good.
Yeah.
You skipped that slide.
I skipped the slide because I want to suggest, like, we'll talk about it later, is what this book can suggest in terms of social science research. So here, I mean, the one thing that political science does not do very well is study leaders, right? And like any history book you pick up, you kind of think that, had it not been Nehru and had it been another person, probably like the trajectory of Indian politics might have been completely different. And we focus a lot on structural factors, and we think that leaders emerge. And one way to bridge that gap might be to maybe just look at the biographies of leaders and like code it in some ways, and code it in terms of, say, their caste, their class, what environment they grew up in. I mean, one of the reasons I think that Gandhi was liberal was because he grew up in port town of Porbandar, which had lots of Muslims. It wasn't the same as, say, Tilak's upbringing, which was very, very segregated, right? Am I out of time?
Yeah. Your final thought.
And my final thought in the same line of thinking is that it's very interesting that like a lot of reformers that you talked about, they are upper caste. But when it comes to passing laws, they're not, that's when it gets very murky. So here you want to question how ideology matters and how power matters. And we can talk about this later again, but what I find very interesting is that, like, for example, in post-independent India, most of the laws that are for OBCs have been possible only when OBCs came to power. And had Ambedkar not had the political standing importance that he did, probably some of the reservations for scheduled castes would not have been possible. So here we need to think about like ideology versus power, because you might be progressive as an individual, but to get institutional change, you have to have power as well. That's it.
Okay. Sorry, but we have to. Thank you. We have one more commentator, and I think Manoj would like to respond to some of this, right? Okay.
It's really a pity that
Yeah, well, the contractual requirements say we need to leave this room at 4 o'clock. So it's a contractual issue after a while. Thibaud Marcesse is an assistant professor of political science at Boston College. Took his PhD from Cornell University in 2018, and the reason I invited him is because I've read his work on panchayat level politics in UP, Uttar Pradesh, where clearly the interplay of caste and politics is for any observer of Indian politics to see today. What happened perhaps in South India in 1920s through 1960s, some version of it is happening, not exactly the same. Certainly not exactly the same, but the way caste has become one of the great drivers and challenging religion, and religion, the way religion is challenging caste, is something to be noted. And let's see what Thibaud has to say. Thibaud, 10 minutes, huh?
Yeah, I'll keep my remarks fairly short in the interest of time. And I don't have slides, but I want to thank you, Asha, for inviting me, and I want to thank you, Manoj, for giving me an opportunity to read this book, which I greatly enjoyed. I have to say, so I don't, like Ashu said, I don't work specifically on caste, and in fact, when I moved to India for my fieldwork, my PhD fieldwork almost 10 years ago now, I wasn't really thinking about, I mean, I knew about caste, obviously, and I knew it would come up at some point, but I never thought it would take so much room in my research. In my current book manuscript, it's absolutely everywhere. I mean, I realized that early on when I was in the field, and I saw that my research assistant, a Brahmin, refused to take water in a village where the majority of the population was from the lower caste, from the scheduled caste. It really sort of drove the point home. In Bahraich. In Bahraich. So I want to say I greatly enjoyed the book. For me, this is interesting because it really made me think of Nicholas Dirk's fabulous book, Castes of Mind, and I see your book as a great companion to that one. And I think what I love is precisely the legal focus and the sort of emphasis on the importance of the law in sort of shaping in interactions, human interactions. And I think it's really, I mean, Dirks has this really interesting sort of description of the social construction of caste over time, going back to the early days of colonial rule, but your book has this really sort of like adds another layer in that sense. I think there's just so much that, I mean, I knew about some of the major pieces of legislation you mentioned in the book, but there's just so much more to those that I had no idea, and I'm very, very grateful. The other thing that I really enjoyed about the book, these are the first sort of general comments I want to make before I turn to some more specific questions, is the way you really sort of focus on the individuals and their interactions and their individual moral dilemmas, right, across the colonial divide, right? So it's not just about upper caste individuals. What should we do with with untouchability? It's also the British officers, teachers who are just like what do we do with this and how do we deal with it? How do we refer to it? And I thought that was actually really fascinating. The other thing that I thought was interesting in the book, and this goes back to the focus on law itself, is that there's always you look at all those different chapters which like deal with like specific issues, social issues or episodes of social reform, and there's always this kind of, especially in the colonial era, you always have this question. You have people challenging, using legal instruments to really, push for social reform, and you see those sort of like lawsuits making their way through the courts, and then you always have that question. You always have that higher, lawyer, judge at a higher level asking that question: how far will this go? Right, I feel like this was very prominent in the colonial times, but it hasn't completely gone away, right? So I thought that was really, really interesting. Two comments I want to make, broad comments with attendant questions, and because I'm a political scientist, I don't exclusively focus on caste. I've read. There's one thing that that really caught my attention. It's this discussion of the 1850 legislation that was being reviewed a few years ago as one of those some of the legislation that should be repealed on the basis that it is obsolete. Obsolete as in old and going back to the Raj, and as a result has to go, right? And it's absolutely you seem to have a knack for these like episodes or where like these are massively important pieces of legislation that just disappear without anyone hardly paying attention. You've identified several episodes, right? It's not the only one, but I thought that was really interesting because it made me think about the relationship between legislation, specifically legislation with respect to caste discrimination, oppression, and the broader Hindutva project. So my research is in UP, and I've done my fieldwork in UP. And what is actually quite remarkable in UP is the way the BJP, specifically the BJP, but like there are other actors involved in this process as well, has really made a point to stay away from the law and any kind of like legal strategy to sort of consolidate support among the lower caste, and specifically the scheduled caste. In UP in 2017, which I take to be a very pivotal election because this is the first time the BJP comes to power on its own, the BJP has really sort of targeted individual caste communities and emphasized and built a narrative for those communities that is essentially historical, that is removed from any kind of legal implications in terms of how do we fight discrimination, how do we use the law to fight discrimination. It's all about building narratives of pride, so caste pride, but in a very sort of like twisted way, right? This caste pride is always about the exclusion of Muslims, right? It's always, well, you may be at the bottom of the caste hierarchy, but look, these Muslims invaders came 600 years ago and they destroyed your communities and you had local heroes who fought against them, blah, blah, blah. And some of this is true, some of it is not, right? But it seems to be working. All right, and so it's really interesting to, and this is sort of like the beginning of a broader discussion I hope that we'll have on, how do we bring the law back in a way to sort of prevent this sort of dislocation of the lower castes and their sort of like instrumentalization by the broader Hindutva project. So the second comment I had, a fairly broad comment with again some questions, is this broader question. I mean, what I felt in the book throughout the book was this sort of like there's always this tension between democracy and social reform. It doesn't seem intuitive. When we think of democracy, we think of like popular participation, mass participation, emancipation from colonial rule in the case of India in 1947. I studied local democracy, the Gram Panchayats. This is a very momentous development in the contemporary history of India, having local elections across 600,000 villages in the whole country. All of this is very momentous, but then there's so many references, and I'm remembering the specific discussion you had a chapter on the temple entry debates, right? And something I didn't know that the debate really pitted people who wanted to sort of push members of the lower caste who were previously excluded to enter forcefully into the temples. And people who thought that actually the people should have a say, the broader community should have a say. And Gandhi appeared to be actually on the latter side, which is absolutely fascinating. And so I think there's always, and you quote Ambedkar several times. There's a really good quote which speaks to this sort of like tension, I think, right? When basically, I think Ambedkar talks about the tyranny of the minority. When he talks about, the quote I think is, "Sin and immorality cannot become tolerable because the majority is addicted to them, or because the majority chooses to practice them. If untouchability is a sinful and immoral custom, in the view of the oppressed classes, it must be destroyed, without any hesitation, even if it is acceptable to the majority." But at one point, I think he uses the term. You quote Ambedkar. 1 minute, right? You quote Ambedkar as saying, we need to protect the lower caste from the tyranny of the minority. And I was thinking in my head, well, what is he really? Which minority is he really referring to, right? But I think he was really. I mean, Ambedkar was known for this sort of broader understanding of caste, not just as a sort of majority-minority sort of oppressive system of oppression, but more as a relative system of oppression, with each individual caste always feeling it's better off than the group below, and thus sort of like blocking, like sort of preventing broad-based mobilization against discrimination. And so I again, another way for us to continue the conversation or take the conversation in a different direction. How does democracy really solve that tension? Because it's still very present today, and it's sometimes helped remove some of the traditional sort of markers of discrimination, and at some other times it's actually worked against that.
Thank you. So, Manoj, in the 10 minutes that we have, I can extend it by 5 minutes. I can, and right, but we'll have to leave after that. 10 minutes that we have, we can go till 5 minutes after 4. There are two choices. Either you can respond to the commentators, or you can take some more feedback. I leave it to you. No, I leave it to you. We can have some more feedback. I'm sure there will be. The audience has some questions, either about how it was written, or some about law per se, or after hearing. And let me suggest one thing. Let's hear what the audience has to say. It'll be nice, right? It'll be very nice to hear what questions they have in mind. We'll see whether we have some time at the end, but otherwise those questions will perhaps appear somewhere else when you give a talk in the remaining 11 universities. And perhaps therefore the discourse can move forward, right? So in that interest, in the interest of advancing knowledge of discourse, let's hear what some members of our audience might have to say. Any questions, any comments, anyone? If no one has comments, then you can come and talk to about the commentary. Questions? Yeah, please. Yeah. Any questions? Any comments? Yes, I can see two. Wazira, let's start with Wazira.
We can start with the gentleman too. Mine was mostly like thinking with not having read the book, but thank you very much for what seems like a massive exercise. I wondered, if one thinks about caste as lawmaking itself, and then all of these attempts by the history of caste, legal attempts to bring the state in to adjudicate and make transformation. The problem, to what extent, is thinking of caste as religion? So going to Poulomi's point of like different kinds of stratification in society, but that relationship between caste and religion is something that's sort of at the center of annihilation of caste, which is that one of the obstacles remains, it seems, from all the piecemeal legislation, this disentangling of stratification, discrimination from the religious aspects of caste, different from racial or civilizational forms of stratification. And so a question like, how does one grapple with this question of religious transformation and social transformation when they seem to be profoundly entangled in the history of law?
Gandhi has an answer to that.
Yes, I know Gandhi
calls it part of Hindu social order, not part of Hindu religion. And he says, apart from two books, you can't show that it plays a very big role. So, but anyway, but there is
Gandhi's one interlocutor of like many.
So in Rig Veda you'll get it in Dharmashastra, in the Manusmriti, and after that you don't get any central treatment of caste in a religious text. And he also argues there is no religious text in Hinduism. What makes Hinduism is saints, he argues. So which saints are you talking about, Mr. Ambedkar? That's a very interesting debate. I mean, whichever side you come out on, it's a very, very interesting debate. The idea that it's not integral to Hinduism is Gandhi's main claim. Yes, sir.
As an unpassionate bystander, and I happen to be a physician.
Yeah.
And so you already mentioned, like, caste is the root of caste. But the problem, from medical point of view, is disease, right? And untouchabilities, mass violence, impunity are the symptoms. So see, the answer is very simple, right? Unless you reform the caste, you cannot solve other problems.
Okay. That caste is so central in this, but for example, religious riots also can be explained that way, which would be, I don't know where that will go. Yeah.
Thank you. I unfortunately also haven't had a chance to read the book, but this was really illuminating. I think my question kind of builds off of Anu's question about thinking about caste as law. And one of the things that struck me in the opening of your talk was you sort of referenced this question of silence and sort of how there's a sort of silence around caste in the legal archive and how scholars have written about law as it relates to caste. And I wonder how you're thinking about playing with the sort of category of silence. So if you're thinking about Anu's question, right, which is that caste is itself a legal structure, right? It mimics or parrots the structure of law in terms of how endogamy is sort of dealt out, how people are allowed or not allowed to move through space, touch, etc. There's a certain kind of implicit, if we want to use an anthropological word, right, habitus that is sort of organized through the practice of caste. And I wonder then what that fact might do for how you're thinking about this question of silence, and in particular how, so to take a parallel example, right, post-colonial scholars have argued that, right, the silence in the archive is actually sometimes the thing being sort of everywhere in the archive. So this is Anjali Randakar's work on sexuality, for instance. Just because the archive doesn't mention non-normative sex doesn't mean that it's not already organizing the archive. And so for you, I wonder if in your thoughts around caste and law, if there's a silence around how caste and law are sort of working together, particularly around this question of impunity, which I think is really important, if that silence is actually gesturing to the very fact of caste as being omnipotent.
Okay, so maybe we can take this question. This is a very important one. It's also on my mind, and maybe let's see if there are any other questions. But if there are no other questions, is caste law? That is, in some ways, this is where the argument is going.
I'm not asking that it is law. I'm saying that it performs
caste
itself.
is it inherently legal, or caste is law-like maybe?
It's a legal
as opposed to,
performance,
right?
maybe, yeah.
So when you ban hook swinging in Madras Presidency, it's not. So it's a regulation of a custom, huh? But it's not clear that a huge body of law is being deployed to do that. So you're banning hook swinging, and there's a tremendous chapter in Nick Dirks on that. But is it not then law-like feature here, which is being dealt with? And have not historians dealt with that, even though they may not have dealt with the very formal law that you're talking about? Would you? Let's talk about that in the last 5 minutes of our. Yeah.
Yeah. I'm not entirely sure if I've understood the question you were asking me, but I don't want you to restate.
No, but see, Anupama is saying that by talking about very formal legislation.
Yeah, I do want to address.
Yeah, formal legislation. You're removing the context, and often it's the context which is very law-like. That's
sure,
right.
sure. So let me begin. Is Anupama still with us?
I don't know.
Okay.
She may be. I have no idea.
Okay.
She may not. But anyway.
No. Because I want to make this disclaimer that yes, in my loose verbal presentation or even in my preface, I might have sounded as if this is a pioneering work on law and caste. No, I in fact paid tribute to a pioneer who when I was doing my fellowship in DC, I had the opportunity of meeting, interacting closely with him, and that is Mark Galanter, who did work in 50s and 60s on this question of law and caste. And he was very delighted to meet me because he was saying that what he did was merely scratching the surface. There's so much more that needed to be done, but somehow the legal aspect people lost sight of. But there's no getting away from the legal aspect otherwise, even if you don't formally see it as the legal aspect, because caste is inherently legal in the sense that what comes through in these debates in legal, legislative or judicial, that in Hinduism it is caste system that has a coercive apparatus. It is that which can reward you or disqualify you. It can impose penalties on you, whereas Hinduism itself was a very loose conglomeration of beliefs where anything and everything was allowed. So you could even be, as they famously say, you could even be an atheist and yet be considered a Hindu. But when it comes to caste, that is the non-negotiable, inviolable aspect. If you dare cross the caste lines, then the caste association, in fact, Anupama herself had written extensively on this in her book about caste associations, the clout they wielded. It is the caste associations which imposed whatever passed off as religion. It's not so much the religious bodies themselves, because you had the option. It was not based on one religion or one set of beliefs. You need not even go to a temple. So you had all that free play. So the liberty that Hinduism gave was probably extraordinary. But when it comes to equality and fraternity, which were the aspects that the caste associations dealt with, they were very restricted. there was no scope for equality across varnas. It was only, within that varna you could have some degree of interaction and so on and so forth. So for even somebody like Gandhi, there was a long time when he was, very unabashedly a votary of restriction on inter-caste dining, inter-dining. He found that, perfectly all right, because that's where he came from. And there isn't one view that, Gandhi ever expressed on caste. He was, like anybody else, constantly evolving. So it's, what comes through in my book, and I said this in my preface also, that in the context of caste, Gandhi doesn't quite come across as a Mahatma. For much of his life, he was lagging behind many of his contemporaries, whether in his own Congress party or among his adversaries. And those adversaries could even be among who we consider today as Hindu right. There were times when Hindu Mahasabha was more progressive than Congress under Gandhi's influence, because Gandhi was strategically engaged in this task of carrying as many people as possible with him. So strategically he called himself a Sanatani. One of the most fascinating aspects is the long debate he has with a real true blue Sanatani, that is Malavian, on the question of temple entry. So they are dueling on this question, who is a greater Sanatani and stuff like that. So you can clearly see that in public, Gandhi positions himself as Sanatani so that he can talk with these orthodox elements on equal terms and say, I'm no less a Hindu than you. But in his private life, in his ashram, he was a radical. He would himself engage in menial tasks. He would force, as was famously shown in that movie Gandhi, he would have a conflict with his own wife, who was objecting to being forced to clean toilets. He says, no, in my ashram there are no exceptions. Everybody cleans toilets. And he goes on to adopt a Dalit girl, Lakshmi, as his daughter. So he does all these, he violates caste rules in his private life. But in public, he positions himself as an orthodox Hindu in order to be able to carry all sections with him. So that kind of battle is going on. So in these caste battles, and there's so much that one can go into, there's so much, I'm so deeply grateful to the three, commentators or discussants. They've made such amazing points, but I'm pressed for time. I can see.
Yeah, on this whole question about Gandhi and caste, I mean, the Gandhi versus Periyar debate is also very fascinating, right?
Yeah.
And you're right. I think in his, he's not openly saying that, but the political hypothesis about that is clear. That the critical question in 1930s India cannot be caste. It has to be getting rid of the colonial masters. And if you open up the caste front, you start dividing up India, and you cannot fight the colonial masters. Right?
At the same
so
time,
you need some unity here.
Yeah. At the same time, to bring about unity, he believes that he needed to engage with the Hindu-Muslim question, and he also needed to engage with the question of untouchability.
Right.
What he found himself at odds with, he found out of his depth was the larger question of caste, because that was something that was leading him into all sorts of difficult situations, which he was trying to, sort of ignore. That comes through most clearly on his, evolving and changing positions on intercaste marriage. When Patel introduces that bill in 1918, it may have come as a surprise to many, or even a shock, that Gandhi publicly opposed it, right? And then later in his own life, what he sees is his son, one of his sons, gets into an intercaste marriage with the daughter of Rajaji, right? So she ends up, the son ends up getting married despite Gandhi's opposition to intercaste marriage, and it was legally possible only because that option of marrying under civil marriage was available, and that became available to Hindus without disclaiming Hinduism. Before 1922, only Brahmo Samaj people were eligible to get married under civil marriage law. One of the legislators who defied his ban on participating in the colonial structure in 1920, he famously came up with non-cooperation movement. So he wanted all these legislative bodies to be banned. Now, among the legislators who defied that ban and participated in that legislation, came about this reform. He got the legislature to apply civil marriage law to Hindus. So because of that 1922 reform, brought about by Hari Singh Gaur in 1922, Gandhi's own son later in 1930s could marry. Otherwise, that intercaste marriage was invalid, right? And then later in his life, Gandhi is at his best towards the, at the time of independence, closer to his death, on the question of Hindu marriage, Hindu-Muslim issue. There was a very controversial phase early on when he engaged in that Khilafat movement. People found his solutions, his recipes very controversial, right? But towards the end of his life, now Kali, the way he managed peace in Delhi, that he was at his best on Hindu-Muslim question. He was also at his best on caste, because he goes on to say that now I've reached a stage where I not only believe in intercaste marriage, he goes on to say that I will now attend only such intercaste marriages. In intercaste also there are two very objectionable ones from the point of view of orthodox elements. One more objectionable than the other. Which one was that? That one was, there was Anupama, where the girl up, marries up. The lower caste woman marries an upper caste man. Pratiloma, which was more objectionable, is where the girl marries down. An upper caste woman, a Brahmin, marries a Shudra or a Dalit. So that was considered absolute taboo. So Gandhi, towards the end of his life, is on record saying, if I ever attend a wedding, I will go to a Pratiloma marriage, where an upper caste woman is marrying a Dalit. He becomes that radical, and this couldn't have been more different than the very conservative, retrograde positions Gandhi himself took earlier in his life. So you have to be very nuanced and careful about, which Gandhi you are talking about, because he was constantly evolving. Ambedkar also was evolving. There's so much that I write about Ambedkar too. There's so much that I want to respond to you. And,
so let's continue the conversation over the reception.
Fascinating things.
They are also, they can contractually here only until a certain time. People who are there in the reception. Let's time for applause. Thank you, Anupama, if you're still there. Thank you. Thank you, Thibaud. And thank you, Poulomi.